Okay, so with me today, Frank Furman, COO of Padsplit, and I want to jump in. We're going to talk a little bit about Padsplit, but I want to kind of rewind the clock a little bit. Talk to me a little bit about growing up. Your bio is pretty impressive. Went to the Naval Academy, officer in the Marine Corps. So talk to me about maybe the years even before that. Why did you go to the Naval Academy? What was your upbringing like? Where did you grow up?
Sure. So I grew up outside of Philadelphia, and father was a physician. My mother worked for Villanova University, and part of the whole Naval Academy story was that I really kind of didn't know what I wanted to do, to be honest. Still trying to work that out, and it was a bit of a timeline issue. So I was a junior in high school when 9/11 happened, and when you're 17, 18, you think everything exciting that's ever going to happen in the world is going to happen in the next couple of years, and that seemed kind of like the exciting thing to do. And so I went, and to some extent it was also kind of kicking the can down the road. I thought, I don't really know what I want to do. I'm not going to go into the family business. Actually, my father always kind of discouraged me from going into medicine, and so I just kind of went for it. And then actually while I was there, I decided to be a Navy pilot. That was kind of why I went. I majored in aeronautical engineering, and then in 2005, Katrina hit and really kind of devastated the Gulf Coast and slowed down naval flight training, which is in Pensacola. And again, I'm like just 2 years older, and I'm looking around, and my kind of older friends who went into the Marine Corps were going to war, and my older friends who were pilots were kind of playing golf in Pensacola, which in retrospect probably would have been a pretty good deal. But I looked at it, and you're just kind of anxious, and you're thinking, oh, I'm going to miss it, I'm going to miss it, I'm going to miss it. And well, I did miss it for what it's worth. So I missed Iraq, but decided to go Marine Corps infantry, much to my mother's chagrin. So that's what I did. I did a quick stint in grad school kind of before that, but joined the Marine Corps, did my platoon command and company command tours out in 29 Palms, California, two deployments to Afghanistan, and then headed back to DC for an R&D role. I was a program manager at the Office of Naval Research, so I had a portfolio of kind of R&D programs that I oversaw for the Marine Corps.
Oh, interesting. So growing up, what are there any experiences from your childhood that kind of stick in your mind that have kind of shaped your worldview, or things that you remember? It could be from your parents or a coach or a teacher that were really formative in how you think about the world, work, the role of money, how we should interact as people in community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me, we were raised in a very financially conservative home where, kind of debt was verboten. It wasn't kind of how we thought about things. We weren't big on having IOUs out there. And to some extent that drove why I went to the Naval Academy too. And that for me, I looked at it and thought, hey, here's a way that I can do it without having my parents pay, without taking on debt, and kind of being self-sufficient, and kind of self-sufficiency being a big part of our values and how we kind of thought about it in terms of personal responsibility and being responsible for your actions. So that was definitely a big driver for me. And then actually, interestingly enough, when I was in grad school, I lived in a rooming house. We didn't call it that, but it was one of those things where I needed a place for 6 months. I didn't have a ton of money, and again, we didn't call it a rooming house, and it was sort of on the fancier end. But I was renting a room from a guy who owned the house, and that's kind of what you did. And it was short term, and it was month to month, and it was furnished. And now, many years later, you look at it and you think, oh, this is kind of what I ended up in all along. So I didn't think so at the time, didn't know it, but it kind of came full circle for me.
Yeah. So grad school, Marine Corps, 2 tours in Afghanistan, R&D for the Marine Corps. So what are the steps between there and Padsplit?
Sure. So when I was, this would have been 2012 to 2014, I was living in DC. I was married in 2011. My wife was also, we met at the Naval Academy. She was also in the Marine Corps. So we were, we spent our first year apart, actually. I was stationed in California. She was in North Carolina. I actually deployed to Afghanistan the day after our honeymoon ended. So,
goodness.
Yeah. Although we did actually see each other over there. She was a motor T truck platoon commander, and she actually resupplied our position a couple times. And there were no women at our space, so it was it kind of created an uproar a little bit. But a little supply and demand challenge there. But So we moved to DC, and she became pregnant. So with our first child, our older son, Rudyard, who's 5 now. And, I was kind of, again, afraid of commitment, not knowing what I wanted to do. What do you do after the Marine Corps? So I was like, oh, I'll go to business school. That seems like a thing that I can postpone my decision around. And so, kind of went down that path, and I kind of applied to McKinsey on a whim. I didn't really know anything about management consulting, but I got an offer in London, and then found out that my wife was pregnant. And I'm like, well, do I want to eat ramen noodles in business school, or do I want to just go to work? So that's what I did. And so we moved to London. Our son was born in May. I moved to London in August. And, so we switched jobs, switched countries, became parents, all kind of that summer, and just started a whole kind of new life there, doing that, and mostly serving pharmaceutical industry, private equity, Ministry of Defense. And we spent about 2 years there, and decided to, when we were pregnant with our second child, it was just kind of couldn't manage it again. Sort of the housing crisis again rears its head. Living in London on really any salary is pretty tough. But we thought we need more space. We want to think about schools and kind of our long-term plan. So I'm from Philadelphia again. My wife is from New Orleans. I wanted to move and transfer to Philadelphia. She didn't want to live near my parents, which is fair. And she wanted to go to New Orleans, but McKinsey didn't have an office there. So we compromised with Atlanta, which is where her where her brother lives now, who is now my business partner, Atticus.
Oh, interesting. And
so that's how I came to be in Atlanta. And so we moved there, transferred, and I spent about a year at McKinsey in Atlanta. And we kind of got to the point where she wanted to go back to work. I was traveling all the time, and our kids were beginning to get a little bit older. So I decided to leave and take a job at Georgia Pacific. And I ran part of their B2B paper towel portfolio. And it was a great experience, and I loved the culture, and I was really, really bored. And I kind of went from working 60, 70, 80 hours a week to really struggling to put in 20, wow. 25, and spent a lot of time at the gym, read a lot of novels, and, I was just bored. And that's kind of how we began to get involved in Padsplit, in that Atticus had a similar, so I've known Atticus for almost 15 years now. And I moved to Atlanta, and we were seeing each other a whole lot. He has 4 boys, I have 2, and we live about a mile apart. So, and I'd been an LP in some of the deals he'd been doing over the course of years. In fact, still I'm in one, but he built up a portfolio of single-family homes, kind of starting in 2008, and then went into apartments. So I'd known him. I was not on the operating side of the business, but kind of knew his business partner and his team and kind of way of doing things. And he kind of got to the point after, in 2016, he'd spun off the apartments and hired partners to run the general construction side of the business, and they started a hard money loan business, but he wasn't running it, and he was kind of twiddling his thumbs, and I was kind of twiddling my thumbs, and we meet up for lunch, and he's like, oh, I'm working on this thing, I'm calling it Padsplit, what do you think? And I was like, oh, let's find out. It seems kind of weird, it seems kind of dumb, I don't know. And so just started getting involved a little bit, a little bit more. And at the time, it was just kind of a side hustle for him. He'd written a white paper for the city of Atlanta, and, to address affordability challenges, and had gotten some traction with it, and started with the prototype house in December of 2017. And it was kind of a very typical story for us at the time, where he'd owned a house. It was a Section 8 rental, kind of a older woman lived there, and all of a sudden AHA, the Atlanta Housing Authority, reached out to him and said, you got to look at what's going on in the house. There's these YouTube videos, there's drugs, and there's guns, and there's lots going on. And sure enough, there were these rap videos, and they were very low production quality for what it's worth. The one's still up on YouTube. And it's terrifying, as a landlord. You think, oh gosh, what's going on in this house? And it's a big problem for, in particular, larger Section 8 homes. You've got the tenant, but you don't have much control over what's going on beyond that. And it's, especially the larger ones, it's an invitation to, not just family, but friends of family and so on and so forth. You have a lot of people in the house, and, one of those bullet holes in the door, lots of damage to the house, neighbors are up in arms. So he said, all right, we're going to do this as a Padsplit. So he'd had experience running the model for really the previous 10 years. He'd kind of stumbled into it in 2009, run 2 houses kind of on the sly and learn the business. And so that became the first house. And So I started getting involved then, and we found another owner to come on with additional houses in February, and we just sort of started building it up. And then that summer I kind of had a decision point to say, all right, is this something I'm going to do full time and commit myself fully to, or am I going to just stop and figure out something new? And so we took the plunge, joined a tech accelerator that summer, Techstars in Atlanta, and then kind of built it from there.
So so you've had an interesting, like, just personal career journey. But I think it's also interesting to think about Padsplit, in the impact space. So we're talking at the Winter Innovation Summit, which is all about impact and an orientation towards community, and how do we reconcile profit, stakeholder engagement with shareholder return. And I think it's an okay thing that a person's journey or a company's journey towards impact there's not one road, there's not one path. So talk to me about Padsplit and like its origin. Did it start out with this underlying goal to solve for some of the issues of housing affordability, or was it like someone's experience or you and your brother-in-law's experiences in kind of the real estate industry, recognizing, okay, there's a need, and I think there's an opportunity to make some money in a creative model? Talk to me about kind of like the reconciliation of those two things as you guys have built the business.
Yeah, they really always went hand in hand. There was, we kind of always started with this conviction that if you wanted to create affordable housing units, there was a path to do it through subsidy, through kind of a purely impact-based model, but it was slow and it was painful. You had to compete for subsidies, and you never could really do it the way you wanted to do it. You had to you were always kind of begging. And our kind of core conviction was, if you want to do it and you want to do it big and you want to do it at a massive scale, you had to do it in a way that incentivized property owners to where they made more than they would in a market rate rental. And that was kind of how you mobilize the energy and effort and kind of just resources of the private investor market. So we always kind of started with that conviction, but at the same time recognizing that, for one, what we do is edgy in a regulatory sense, and it's kind of a new model, and it's in that change kind of challenges some people. So people all the time ask us, what's your regulatory strategy? How do you think about this? How do you think about that? And we always thought, ultimately, if we did it well and we did it responsibly and we created value for communities, we'd be tolerated. And if we didn't, we would, aggressively be, legislated out of existence. And, it's never quite that simple, but we always kind of knew we had to do it in a way that demonstrated that we were helping people. And ultimately, the goal wasn't just to make money. It was to, kind of improve the community, improve people too. And it sounds, maybe a little bit pedantic or, patronizing, and that's not really the intent. But, there's a lot of people in the, social impact space or in the housing space, but more on the, philanthropic side, who think, oh, okay, eviction's a terrible thing. We don't want eviction to happen. We say, okay, agreed, but you also need to hold people accountable. There's the short-term goal of how do I get paid this month, but then there's a long-term goal of how do you create better citizens and better people. And part of that is having boundaries and having expectations. And we should expect more of people, not less. I think it's kind of a soft form of bigotry and a soft form of, how you kind of keep people where they are, to expect little of them and say, okay, well, you're right, you're not going to pay. I can't expect you to do that. We're going to give you some support. Or, I can't expect you to maintain a property well. That's just too hard. So, we'll pick up the slack. And we can't expect people to make a profit off you. So someone else will have to pay. And to me, that seems like selling people short. And so while we certainly come up short ourselves plenty of time, probably every day, that's a big part of the goal is how do you kind of create people who not just can live in a Padsplit for 6 months or a year or 2 years, but can move up the continuum of housing. Because ultimately, people won't live in Padsplits forever. The goal is to get them to be able to move in, to get their own place and get, have some financial stability that they probably haven't had previously. So part of that is holding people accountable, holding people to high standards, both in terms of behaviorally and working with people and solving their problems, but also financially. That's
good. So I can imagine you've got you've got a lot of skeptics as it relates to kind of your model because it's new and edgy, and whereas kind of tenement housing has been a thing historically, it's relatively new as it relates to kind of like how we think about modern living, modern housing. What do you say? I mean, and talk to me a little bit about the tension and how you manage it as a person and as a company. Managing safety. One of the things we talked about yesterday, just working with people that might have a criminal past, and they deserve fair and equitable housing. But there are families oftentimes living in these situations as well. And so how do you reconciling safety, reconciling equity, reconciling a fair chance and showing someone demonstrated grace, but also accountability. There's a lot of things wrapped up in what you do.
Yeah, and I wish I could tell you we've solved it. That would be a lie. We're kind of ever struggling with it as well. And I think what we always kind of harken back to is, there are hard choices, and we should know what those choices are and know what the trade-offs are so that we can make intelligent choices and really kind of bring it back to people. It's easy to say, hey, I don't want any criminals. Okay, that's a perspective. And it's easy to say, hey, I really want to screen effectively. It's like, okay, some of these things are mutually exclusive, and you need to know kind of what your trade-offs are and what you're really kind of deciding. And ultimately, people can say, I really want affordable housing in my community. Oh, but I also don't want it in my neighborhood. It's, that's a perspective, but they're in conflict, and we deal with that quite a bit. So ultimately, what we're trying to do is provide a product that is accountable both to neighbors, to members, and also to the property owners, to where people have choice. We think choice empowers people. And ultimately, some neighborhoods aren't going to be a great fit for us, and neighbors aren't going to be excited about it, and I understand that. That's part of having a community and being able to make choices about it. But ultimately, property owners have rights, what they do in their property, and members have rights in terms of where they want to live. And the goal is to kind of make it as transparent as possible so that at least people know what choices they're making. They have, they can vote with their wallet. If you're a member, you can move from a bad house to a good house, and that way they can hold property owners accountable, property managers accountable, which is very important. So we do face a lot of skeptics, and we ultimately try and present choices to people as fairly as possible. And whether it's a politician who says, hey, I really care about affordable housing, but I don't like what you do. And we're like, okay, well, what do you propose? These are your choices. Or, to the community, there are people in the affordable housing advocacy space who say, I don't like what you're doing. I think people should all have their own subsidized place. They should all have their own house. And say, okay, great. What are you cutting? You're going to cut education? You're going to cut infrastructure? I mean, I'm all ears, happy to talk about it, but these are hard choices and they're scarce resources, so we should think about it. And, ultimately, same thing with neighbors. Neighbors will say, well, I don't want this in my neighborhood potentially. And say, okay, fine. You want it to be a Section 8 rental? Do you want it to be a different kind of rental? What's going to be responsive to you and your needs? And ultimately, there are choices to make. There's no kind of right answer. There are trade-offs in all of it. And we just more want to have the conversation. I think if we can get to that point, we can usually kind of muddle along. And if we don't get to the conversation, we're probably done. So
yeah. So and you had mentioned you were somewhat bored, and then your brother-in-law, you've known him for years. He kind of conceived of this idea and jumped in. But you've been at it for a while now, personally. And so there's the okay, I'm bored, I want to do something different and exciting, but you're doing this thing called Padsplit, which is pretty interesting. Tell me about the day you realized this was something you personally were interested in continuing to push forward, and something that you were personally interested in, committing yourself to.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, and I really kind of got started kind of full time to where I ratcheted it back up to the 60, 70 hour weeks in kind of July of 2018 now, so about a year and a half ago. And I think really over that summer, kind of in the fall, when things began to pick up and we began to get interest, and I think what kind of validated it for me, because I always was involved with the members, especially early on, where we were all kind of doing everything from plunging toilets to answering the phones to collections and the whole bit. So I was always very engaged in that side, but I had my own sense of skepticism to say, is this really a winner? Can we do this? Can you scale it? All these challenges. And then come that fall, we started to try and raise money. And it was really kind of in those first, as we tried to quantify it for investors and outside investors to say, this is why we think it can be really big. This is why we think it can't just work in West Atlanta where we got our start, but all of Metro Atlanta, every major metro area. This is why we think it could be big, and kind of pressure testing those ideas with some smart folks. And, all of a sudden you fast forward a couple of months and we raised the seed round, and like, wow, maybe this isn't so insane. Other people are into it. And, began to sort of catch on. And there's a lot of momentum in this kind of world where, you get one believer and then you've got three, and then you've got three, and then you've got 10. And there's just a lot of momentum to any kind of success. And, all of a sudden, I don't think there was one kind of epiphany, but, you'd all of a sudden look at yourself and think, oh, this has some legs maybe, and this is not, crazy. And people who are serious are actually, returning our calls and the whole bit. And, it was more of a slow realization to think, hey, I think this thing has legs and I can really help people.
And I think I saw recently Padsplit was listed as a kind of a top innovator in kind of some of the housing issues. So talk to me about some of the challenges that you guys are facing presently, in 2020. Like what are some, like, granted there's some traction and you're picking up some new pilot cities and different things like that, but what are some of the challenges you're facing right now as a company?
Yeah. How much time do we got? No, yeah, we have a few, or we have a lot really. So on, we're a two-sided marketplace. We have kind of the demand side, so to speak, the member side, and then the supply side, the property owner side. And they each have their own unique challenges and some of the differences. And so on the member side, the supply side, we have a fundamental challenge of balancing accessibility and screening, for example. How do you do really sophisticated credit scoring for a population that's 40% unbanked? How do you do that well in a way that still admits a lot of people? It's easy to make sure you have zero credit risk. You can just take nobody. That's an option. Bad for occupancy rate, but how do you optimize around that? And then all through the process, how do you build a simple, easy to use product that is very clear for a population that, one, does it almost all on mobile, doesn't have a lot of financial capacity, doesn't have a ton of technical literacy, oftentimes doesn't have a credit card. Maybe they've prepaid debit, or they change debit cards all the time because they're getting them from different sources and so on. And how do you balance that off all the fraud prediction software that says, if someone uses 4 credit cards, they're probably stealing. Well, okay, how do you adjust that for what you're doing, but still protect, the bottom line? So how do you kind of do that well for a market that's really broadly misunderstood or not understood at all by the fintech community? So that's definitely a big challenge. And ultimately, so that's kind of on the ingress side. And then for the operations of the house, there's some fundamental challenges within co-living. Just as an example, if you're in normal property management or you're just a normal landlord, if someone does something in a house, it's bad, but they put wet wipes down the toilet or break something. Well, one, who did it, right? It's the people in the house. And even if it was their friends or a guest, well, it's still on you. So they did it, who to hold accountable. If you need to charge somebody, who to charge. And the people who are suffering the brunt of it can kind of look in the mirror and say, oh, okay, well, this is on us. So it's much easier. For us, if a toilet backs up and there's a problem, one, you don't know who to point the finger at. You can find everybody. It makes you wildly unpopular. I can tell you from experience. And ultimately, if it's 6 people in a house, 5 people who did nothing wrong are dealing with the problem. So there's just a really difficult accountability and transparency problem that is in co-living. And it's not as though, the person who caused the problem is like, what, that was me. Everyone point the finger. And that's a challenge. It's part of living in a house with other people. I also live in a house with 4 other people. I'm in a co-living situation. I just happen to be the only person paying. But so, we're used to it. I have 2 young boys, so there are occasionally things that are put in the toilet. That happens. But again, like it's much easier to handle in a family and in a more cohesive unit, and much harder in a co-living situation with people who are not necessarily strangers once they're living there, but are strangers when they come in and don't have the same kind of level of trust and accountability within the group. So that's a big challenge. Collections is a very difficult business in the demographic we're in. It's never easy, and you're fundamentally dealing with people with a low level of financial security, a low level of job stability, who frankly don't have a high level of financial literacy, ability to budget, who sometimes err and are human, and ultimately have less capacity to get past those errors when they make them. So, they have a bad day and spend too much money on something. Well, that's much harder for someone who has a higher income. So that's a challenge. So yeah, plenty of challenges on the member side, and we're kind of always struggling through it. On the supply side, we probably, from the start, we were probably overly concerned with legitimizing slumlords, I think is kind of the polite way to put it. So we're probably overly cautious, and we put a lot of controls in terms of who we would work with and who we would trust to put properties on our platform. And ultimately, we've been pretty impressed with who we've gotten to work with. But I would say there's still an element of how do you really convince folks to not necessarily do the right thing, but to think through all of the challenges. And it's easy for me to say because this is all I do 24/7, and I think, oh, what kind of weird lock would help with this situation? Or, how should you lock a thermostat to control utility spend? And I'm sort of a nerd about this stuff, and that's okay. But for your kind of retail investor who's, maybe owns a couple houses, or even a, sub-institutional investor who has a portfolio of 50 to a couple hundred homes, who really knows a lot about the business, they're used to doing things a certain way. And ultimately, single-family property management or being a landlord is pretty simple, and certain things kind of fix themselves. You get a tenant, they're kind of responsible for a lot of the stuff in the house. Our owners have to turn on utilities. That's a challenge. You have to get Wi-Fi installed. You have to think through smart locks and how to connect them to the internet. And none of the individual things are particularly difficult, but enough of them add up that, they make mistakes, they miss things. And, ultimately you have to kind of balance, driving these people and holding them really accountable and freaking out when they do something wrong, and also being like, okay, you're a customer too, we need to work through it and everything. So that's certainly a problem. And then kind of in the midst of that, the whole fundraising and building a product and, managing a technical product that is a work in progress that you built from scratch, and, the whole normal startup company stuff that is always just dumpster fire every day.
So you're not busy.
No, not at all.
No.
Yeah.
So I think for me, I know sometimes because like what the problems you're trying to solve are pretty big. So what I do personally is I have a couple of stories that I lock away, like successes where like, okay, I remind myself of these things that kind of make it worth it. Do you have any stories like that of members that you've worked with, or situations that have been really like, wow, okay, this is why I do this? Yeah,
I mean, the one that we really like to think about a lot is this woman, Laura, who's been with us for about 2 years, essentially the whole time. She's one of our first members. And, she was really almost a defining story for us in a lot of ways. And, she's a pastry chef at SCAD in Midtown Atlanta. She was working about 2 days a week because she was commuting from Griffin, Georgia, which is about 2 hours south of Atlanta. So good ways. And she's kind of emblematic of your drive till you qualify kind of renter, because that was cheapest place that she could afford. And so, she had a good job, but she couldn't work a ton of hours. And in the summer, when her hours were cut, she slept at the airport. And it's one of those things. I mean, I used to fly out of the airport every single week, and you'd see people in the winter, and you're like, man, why does it kind of smell bad in the food court? And it's like, well, that's where homeless people go when it's cold. It's where they hang out, because it's the one place where it will let people in. So, she was one of those people, really, kind of hanging out in the airport lobby. And so she did that for 4 straight summers.
Goodness.
And then she found us. And that was very early on. We were, posting rooms on Craigslist. We probably looked pretty fly by night, to be honest, but she took a chance on us. And, she's probably, I guess I could have looked it up. She's probably in her late 40s. She's never going to make a ton of money. She's never going to be much for budgeting. We've spent a lot of time and energy kind of reminding her to pay and talking her through and payment plans and this and that. But, here we are 2 years later. She's had a roof over her head the entire time. She's been able to work more hours. She's been a more productive citizen. And, it's still a struggle, and she's not there. It's never a completed project where you say, okay, now Laura's got, a house in the suburbs. She's got a Mercedes Benz. Like, none of that is true, but she's changed her life in a lot of ways, and she's built habits that will hopefully benefit her, even when she's left Padsplit, hopefully. So we refer to them as graduations, when people eventually save up enough to get their own place. Sometimes, get a car, get a down payment on an apartment, that sort of thing, or a security deposit. And, it doesn't always work out that way, but she's kind of emblematic of that. And then on the owner side, actually our first owner was a woman named Heather who, she has an interior decorating business. She would stage houses for folks, and she was not really a real estate investor, but, she's kind of crazy enough to give us a try. And she was our first kind of external owner. And so she bought a house, fixed it up herself, got it ready, and made enough money to do another one, and then another one, and then another one, and then another one. And now she's at the point where it was kind of a retirement plan. She's not a big shot, and she's not a super sophisticated investor. She doesn't have institutional backing, but she kind of, chased it, did it on the side, did it while working a job. And, she's a mom, she's just kind of doing her thing, but now she's at the point where she is essentially passive income and has helped a lot of people too.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
How many graduates do you have at this point?
It's interesting. We don't really track it as comprehensively as we would like, because for better or for worse, a lot of times, people leave and they don't really respond too much after that. So yeah, I mean, we've had certainly on the order of dozens. I mean, it's awesome. But yeah, we're always trying to seek that elusive percentage.
It's a hard thing to chase, isn't it?
Yeah, no kidding.
So one of my heroes, and I've mentioned this before on another podcast, but is Colin Powell. Mm-hmm. So no offense, I was an Army officer.
Yeah,
so.
No, I know. I don't hold it against you.
So of course he's my hero. So, but what I love about him, and I think a lot of great leaders, is they have a very defined narrative, a North Star that kind of guides who they are, the way they make decisions, and what they're about. And I think about it too as a father, and you're a father as well. Like, what are those principles that I want my children to inherit? Like, what am I trying to instill in them? I've got 18 years before they go off into the world, so to speak. So with your boys, what are some kind of guiding principles that you think are really important to you, and things that you'd like to instill in the next generation?
Yeah, I mean, I think first for me with my sons is to see the good in people, which is probably because I really struggle with it, and I'm naturally kind of very skeptical. I'm naturally a little bit mistrustful, and so it's something that I kind of labor with and really kind of struggle with. So something that I always try to instill in them, that it's very easy to be kind of hard-hearted, or to be mistrustful, and to kind of watch your back and so on, and ultimately, it doesn't make you happy. I don't think it makes you successful. So I think in part because I, again, really kind of am mindful of it and struggle with it, is to, see the good in people, take people as they are, accept flaws, and, not to be foolish about it, but to, give people the benefit of the doubt. And it's kind of a core conviction that most people are fundamentally good. They may err. In fact, they certainly will from time to time. But, I do believe strongly that most people are at least trying to do the right thing. And, they will fall short often, but not nearly as often as we tend to think. So that's certainly one. And, this almost goes against it, but is really just to work hard. I've never really kind of prided myself on being particularly talented or clever, or certainly lucky, but, I've always been able to outwork people. And that's kind of the one tried and true method. Maybe it's because it's the only thing I know, but, it's easy to kind of complain. It's easy to kind of worry about it or hope for things, but, ultimately you can put in the work. And that's kind of the big one for me, and, what I kind of try to instill in them, and which is hard, especially for young boys, because they're like, this is stupid, work is dumb, but, to the extent that you can. And part of that really is just kind of is role modeling in my mind. And that actually kind of get back to your question around what I thought I learned growing up. It kind of came to me late, I think, but, I don't believe anyone really listens to what you say. I think they see what you do and kind of, mimic it, but really, like, actions matter. And ultimately that's, no no one really listens, I think. They just kind of see what you do. So it's all kind of role modeling. And when I think about my father, I think of him working. That's kind of what I saw. He worked long hours, worked really hard, and he cared. And he never really talked about it. Maybe he complained about it. I don't know. But he certainly, he put in the hours, he put in the work. And, I don't know, I didn't really think about it much growing up, but, I look back now and, now I'm older than he was when he had me. And I'm like, oh yeah, I saw my dad working all the time. Like he knew how to put in the hours and get things done and, nose to the grindstone. So that's kind of a big piece of it. And then I think lastly is just to like kind of look within and take personal responsibility. It's very easy for people to find an external tormentor and to blame things on either other people or circumstances or luck. And, ultimately we create our own reality. And it doesn't mean you can't have bad luck. It doesn't mean people can't wrong you or work against you. And, all that's true. But, ultimately you're responsible for your actions. It's all that you can control, and it doesn't do you any good or make you happy to kind of blame other people or circumstances. So you just take ownership and do it.
That's great. So kind of in closing, the problem you are working to solve through Padsplit, housing affordability, it's a major issue. Probably one of the most significant challenges facing our country today. That's just the number of units that we need to properly house our citizens in an equitable fashion. If you could fast forward 20 years, what could you conceive of as things that need to adjust or alter? What is going to get us to that more perfect state where housing is a human right, that people have equitable housing that gives them safety and security and an ability to participate more fully in their community? What does that look like?
Yeah, so the way that I think about it is there's only three ways to reduce the cost of housing. And ultimately, the cost of housing is borne by people, either the people living there or kind of third party, government or otherwise. And those three ways, one is to take cost out, which oftentimes means reducing requirements. So that's tricky. And we're a little bit in that business, right? It's, sharing space, reducing the amount of square footage per person. Second is to operate more efficiently, which is really, really hard, especially when you're talking about equitable housing and local control. But part of it is standardization. Modular housing is kind of in that business. And, how do you essentially sweat your assets a little bit more efficiently? And then the last is to utilize wasted space or utilize underused assets. So companies like Nesterly are like that. We're a little bit in that way in terms of claiming wasted space within houses. And all of those entail hard choices. And so what I would love to see in the next, 6 months, year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years is for people to identify what choices they want to make and be open to making some of those hard choices. We talk a lot about, housing requirements, and it's a really loaded topic because, one man's onerous requirement that drives cost is another person's regulation that keeps people safe. So there's, it's easy to kind of poison the well, and I think that's what a lot of people do. But those are choices that people should be clear-eyed about. And so for me, I think of it, Padsplit's never going to single-handedly solve the affordable housing crisis. I think we part of that solution, hopefully a big part of that solution. But no matter what the solution is, it's going to be, looking into changes and being willing to accept some risk in certain areas to kind of drive that. So, thinking hard about our requirements, whether it's required parking spaces to construction methods to, how we think about risk and financing and that whole piece of the pie. So there's, ditto for local control. It's, again, one man's NIMBYism is another person's caring about their community. They're kind of two sides of the same coin, and we all want a little bit of both. No one is purely NIMBYism, no one's purely local control. We all have a balance that we think is reasonable. And so what I would prefer is really just that we have an open and honest conversation about it and for people to understand what those things mean. And same thing for, rent controls. I mean, again, do rent controls keep rent down? Well, for the people who are currently in a place, but they drive costs up for the person who aren't in those places. So, really understanding what those choices mean and having it less be about ideology and being reactive and just kind of being clear-eyed about the choices that we're making. And I think if we can have that conversation and be honest and open about really what the problems are and the choices that we have to make, I think we can, it won't ever be perfect. I'm not of that persuasion, I think, where I think it'd be perfected, but I think we'd be in a much better place.